Welcome, everybody. If you could all have your seats. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this Schemel Forum at the first of the Schemel Forums to take place at the Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Steven Shimon. I'm the president and dean of this medical school. And several of you, more than a few of you, have thanked me for hosting this here at the medical school. And so I just want to make the point that we may have changed our name to Geisinger, but we will always be TCMC, which stands for This Community's Medical School. And so it is our great honor to host events for the benefit of the community. This past Saturday, we had a Keystone Symposium on the subject of integration of behavioral health into general health care. And we host symposia of all sorts in this auditorium and elsewhere in the building for the benefit of the public. But it is a special pleasure to be hosting the Schemel Forum here. This has been a partnership that we've forged with the Schemel for several years now, which we really celebrate. It is a recognition of our strong connection with the University of Scranton, but also our strong connection with the arts. It is our view here at the Commonwealth Medical College at the Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine. Still takes a while. That teaching the science of medicine is very important. All of our students need to learn that. But those are simply the basic fundamentals. Really, the art of medicine is something that's much more difficult to teach and in many ways much more important. And so we, in our admissions policy, are pay a lot of attention to the whole individual and well beyond their academic credentials. And in our curriculum, we pay a lot of attention to fostering the values of humanism and of empathy. And so there's no better way to do that than by emphasizing the strong and organic links between the arts and medicine. And so I'm thrilled. I've been looking forward for a long time to this talk, and I'm not going to be introducing Harmar because Sandra Myers will be doing that. And so I just want to welcome you all and join me in welcoming Sandra Myers to the podium.
I had some reservations about introducing Harmar Brereton this afternoon, as we have worked so closely together in building the Schemel Forum that it appeared to be a form of nepotism, defined in Merriam-Webster dictionary as favoritism shown to a relative. But frankly, though we are not formally relatives, I was afraid that if I gave my true, unvarnished rave review of him, you might consider it either fake news or an alternative fact. That said, I have thrown caution to the winds and will proceed, although briefly, to let you know that Harmar is the godfather of the Schemel Forum and a kind of prophetic guardian of the Geisinger Commonwealth Medical College, or whatever it's properly called now. That's what I would call it. There would have been no Schemel Forum without Harmar. He started it innocently, one would say, if you will, by asking English professor Rebecca Beale to give a short course on Dante's Divine Comedy to Harmar and a few of his colleagues. Following that, having whetted the appetites of his friends, he asked my husband, Maury Myers, to teach a course on the Federalist Papers. I was living away at the time, but when I got to the grocery store on weekends, it seemed that everybody was talking about these things, so I thought there was promise. I just returned, turning from Washington and newly appointed as the Senior Fellow for International Civic and Cultural Projects at the University of Scranton. I saw a future for this nascent project. The rest, you would say, is history, almost 10 years of it. More featuring at the university each semester, 6 world affairs luncheons, 3 luncheon seminars, not just luncheons, 3 courses, a bus trip, and a collaborative effect such as this one. So they're very special. It's become a very special way of life for some of us. Today's lecture, dare I say, is one that Harmar has been anticipating and drafting for many years, as his passion for medicine is matched only by his fascination and respect for the works of Homer. Disregarding for the moment biblical and Jungian texts, I would say that the Odyssey is for Harmar the gospel according to Homer. So please welcome him to the podium.
Thank you. It is so nice to be home. Thank you all for coming. I thank the 2 people here that have introduced us. I love them both. And I love the institutions that they represent. And to bring them together in this format is very special for me. As we go about learning how to say Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine instead of TCMC, Homer would advise us, well, ask Hermes. He's the god of transition, and he will help you get through from here to there. So we're already getting help from Homer. There are many people I'd like to thank besides Steve and Sandra, my dear friends. I'd like also to thank Father George Schemel and Dr. Jean Monick, 2 of my wonderful mentors that have taught me so much, and I think Barbara, Jean's husband, is here. And of course, my very special teacher, Steve Whitaker. Anything Steve takes is worth your attention, even if it's, of course, on Woody Allen's movies. I'd like to start today with 2 quotations which I think are helpful. William Osler, who is a hero of mine, and there is no finer modern physician, said, if people were all the same, medicine would be a science. But people are not all the same, and that is why people in medicine is an art. And so I'd like to hold that in our minds as we go forward. And the second quote is by Moses Finley, a very great historian who said, the history of America begins in Western Europe, and the history of Western Europe begins in Greece, and the history of Greece begins with Homer. So let's start with Homer. This talk continues a conversation which Steve and Sandra and I and many others here have had about the relationship between the humanities and the arts and medical practice. Are the humanities and the arts simply a diversion for a physician, or are they essential for our understanding as a doctor as we go about taking care of our patients? This is a rhetorical question for me, but a very important topic because it's being dealt with not only at this medical school, but many medical schools around the country. And to this end, Black Diamonds, this medical school's arts newspaper, or news magazine, has 2 recent articles, one by Steve Schonbaum, who's a friend of the school, who wrote the first article, Medicine as a Performing Art. The practice of medicine is a performing art. Steve is a wonderful doctor himself, but he's also a superb pianist, and he plays chamber music. And in his article, he talks about the importance of the relationship between the different musicians in order to get the piece of music performed that you would like. And that, of course, describes what modern physicians should be. And the second article is in this current issue of Black Diamonds and deals with the importance of story. Story is part of history, where we take a history and then we do a physical on our patients. We get to know them. What is their story? What is our story that we take? And the importance of story for a physician is discussed in that particular paper. So we have an interest in the relationship between the arts and the humanities and medicine. But the reason I wanted to start with Homer is because he really is the beginning of the Western tradition. Think of all the terms that we have today that we take for granted. We've all talked about the Trojan Horse, We all have an Achilles heel. Have you used Ajax in your kitchen? And we've all had an Odyssey, and some of us even own one. Honda makes one. So these words are available to us in our everyday language. We take them for granted, but they are offered to us by Homer. The Greeks left us three beautiful literary traditions. Epic poetry. The word epic comes from the Greek word epos, meaning story, and it's very long, very long. And we'll be talking about that today. Shorter poetry, lyric poetry, comes from the word lyre, sing, and that's much shorter, about the same time. And then, 200 years later, Greek tragedy. As you will imagine, or perhaps you know, epic poetry and lyric poetry were not written down. And the reason they weren't written down is that there was no writing. And the reason there was no writing is that there was no alphabet. And one of my postulates that I would like to propose to you today is that the genius of Homer was understood at his time. And some very smart Greek person said, "That's so good, we have to write it down." Because before Homer, there was no writing, and after Homer, there was. Now, what the relationship between his genius and the evolution of Greek writing is, I can't tell you, I don't know. But I like to think it was because of him. Lyric poetry, in the person of Sappho, beautiful poetry, but largely purged during the Middle Ages, and so we have almost none of it left. Only 4 poems that she wrote remain. But we're fortunate to have both of Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. If we have time later on, we'll go over why we even have those. It's so unlikely. These would have survived 2,750 years. How did they make it this far? But they did. Who was Homer? Well, we really don't know. 7 different cities in Greece claim him. But he probably came from Chios, an island 7 miles off the coast of what is modern-day Turkey, at that time the Hittite Empire. But he came from a long line of great bards, great poets. The Trojan War, and we're going to talk about that, occurred probably 1250 BC or sometime a little later. So for 500 years, the story of the Trojan War was told by the bards, the poets who knew these stories and kept them alive throughout all the cities of that part of the world, between Greece, all around the Aegean, and the mainland. Homer was the latest in this line of bards, and everyone knew he was the greatest. But what did he do? Why was it so good? His first poem that we have, which was probably written as a young man, is 16,000 lines long. Way too long to be memorized. You can't memorize something that long. And the genius of Homer was he improvised it every time. It was new. He had a repository of stories that he could tell, but he put them together in the most remarkable ways, compelling his audience, but he did it extemporaneously every time he did it. If you think that's hard, he had to sing it too. He had a lyre with 4 strings, tuned a fourth apart. Pa, pa, that's a fourth. And 2 notes in between. Now that's not a big range, but it was enough for him. And he was able to punctuate and to accompany his poem, this is a poem, by singing, accompanying himself on the lyre. Now I said poem. For hundreds of years, these stories have been told, but it turns out that the sound of the Greek language is perfectly suited to a particular meter, dactylic hexameter. 6 feet, each with dactyls. long, short, short. Bum, bump, bump, bum, bump, bump. 6 of them. And occasionally with a spondee, 2 longs. But that meter worked perfectly for the sound of the spoken Greek language, and so was a perfect receptacle or repository or infrastructure for the poetry that he would offer. Imagine Homer doing this too. These stories are meant to be heard, not read, although we have them written down. If you would like to hear a reading of it, in my opinion, Ian McKellen, who reads Robert Fagel's translation, is absolutely beautiful. And when he does, when he's supposed to sound like a giant, like a Cyclops, like a Polyphemus, he does. And then when he's supposed to sound like a young girl, he does. And I assume Homer did the same thing. If this isn't challenging enough, the audience knew the entire story. There was no secret. So Homer's challenge was to come and recite or create a 16,000-line poem in dactylic hexameter, which he would sing and accompany himself on a lyre, improvising for days as he went, telling the audience a story they already knew. And the genius was he was able to do it in such a way as to keep them on their seat. How the characters and the figures in these stories responded to their circumstances, what they thought, how they thought, all of this is explained by Homer or discussed by Homer, and is what makes his poetry so extraordinary. It's not what happens, it's how it happens. Other things that were helpful to Homer in telling these tales, besides the meter, was that the names meant something. The word Odysseus means pain, suffering. Penelope, his wife, comes from the Greek word meaning weaving, and we perhaps know that she was a weaver, very important, not only what she did, but also weaving of the story. There are more than 40 different epithets for Achilles. So when Homer gets to a place in his story where he needs a particular kind of meter, he has 40 different ways he can describe Achilles so that it would fit where he happens to be in his poem. A third of each poem, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are repeated. I mentioned that the Iliad is older, about 30 years older than the Odyssey, and the Odyssey is later, and I think that's important. These are formulaic, but they're not boring. When we get to the Odyssey, we'll find that Homer goes through a story time and again. Here's Odysseus, and he encounters a fascinating feminine power or woman. And he succeeds in that encounter and then comes back and does it again, and does it again, and again. Homer emphasizes this because it's so important, but it's also a tool with which he can remember the stories that he would like to present to us. I mentioned to you that the Greek alphabet didn't exist until after Homer, and how it came about and why is unknown, but I have some thoughts. For about 100 years before Homer, the climate in Greece had moderated a bit. It was a little bit wetter, a little bit cooler. The growing season had improved. And the Phoenicians, who were the perfect traders all around the Mediterranean, were coming up to Greece more often and taking those goods that were raised there and trading them back along the Levant and around the rest of that part of the Mediterranean. And they brought with them their alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet was problematic because it was only consonants, no vowels. And some very clever person or group took that Phoenician alphabet, added a few vowels, and had a 20+ some series of letters with which they could write down the sounds of the words they spoke. An extraordinary accomplishment. But after Homer, and subsequently, we have these stories written down. That's one of the reasons we still have them. There were other parts of the world where writing existed. In Egypt, for example, with hieroglyphics, and in Mesopotamia, cuneiform had existed for 1,000 years. But those writing and those languages were not suited for literature. They were suited for business, or for commercial, or for political reasons. Very hard to reproduce and very complicated, and only a very well-informed scribe could use them. But not Greek. Once Greek had been figured out, it could easily be copied, easily be spread, and after Homer, his story spread throughout the Mediterranean very quickly. Once this happened and the Greek was written down, the capacity to memorize or remember these stories was quickly lost, probably over a period of years, maybe 100 years. So that these traveling bards would no longer have to remember the stories or synthesize them, they would have them written down, and that capacity was gone. And soon it was doubted that anybody could actually even do that. And it wasn't until 1920, only 100 years ago, that Milman Parry, doing research in Yugoslavia, found a group of people who lived there that were illiterate. They couldn't read or write, but they could tell stories, synthesized stories, just as long as Homer's had been. And that was the modern proof today that Homer actually did what we say. Now, before we get into the Odyssey, how about a little background? The gods are very important. Zeus sits at the top of Mount Olympus, Hera, his sister and his wife, Poseidon, his brother, Hermes, the god of transitions. We've already invoked Hermes to help us in the transition from TCMC to Geisinger Commonwealth Medical School. He'll be helpful there. And Athena, his daughter, Zeus's daughter. And although not a god, a very important figure, one that absolutely fascinates me, Tiresias. Let me tell you a little bit about those people before we go into the Trojan War. The story of Athena's birth is remarkable, perhaps you know it, that Zeus was afraid that a child of his would take over, would overcome him. And because his wife at the time, and Zeus had many, her name was Metis, and she was pregnant. And so Zeus's approach to this problem was to swallow her. Well, he swallowed her, but she was pregnant with her daughter, Athena. And in Greek mythology, Athena is born fully armed with a spear and a helmet and a shield right out of Zeus's mind, right out of his head. You can see this depicted in Greek black and red pottery paintings, but is there a better image of the masculine projection of a powerful woman? I don't think so. Well, she's really important because she loves Odysseus, and when it comes time, we'll talk about that in a bit. And Tiresias. Tiresias, when I discovered who he was and what his role was so helpful in my understanding of the Odyssey. I wanted to share it with you early on before we get into the story. He was a man, and he's not a god, but he lives in the underworld. He rules over the underworld. He's called the blind seer of Thebes. Shakespeare used him in Julius Caesar, Beware the Ides of March. So Tiresias comes back to us time and again through literature. But he's ruling over the underworld, and he is blind, but he can see the future, and he'll become very important to Odysseus when Odysseus has to get home. So, because he is blind and can see the future, he has one other remarkable character, and that is that Hera turned him into a woman. And in Greek mythology, he spent 7 years as a woman, even to the point where he gave, or she gave, birth. This wasn't a hermaphrodite, a person with masculine and feminine characteristics, secondary or primary sexual characteristics. He was fully man, and then 7 years as a woman, and then Hera turned him back into a man. But the point is, he understood the masculine and the feminine perfectly, and he'll become important to us in a bit. The Trojan War, we've said, started this all. The Trojan War started when Paris, who was the Prince of Troy, visited Menelaus in his home in Sparta, and when Menelaus took a trip to Crete, Paris went back to Troy with Menelaus' wife, Helen. There's a lot of background, but we'll leave it for that. And the Trojan War deals with Menelaus retrieving his wife. He was utterly shamed. This is a culture of shame. You can't let that happen to you without responding. And so Menelaus builds the troops, gathers his colleagues, and off he goes to retrieve his wife. And we know that that happens because there's a story all the way through the war. Odysseus, who we'll introduce momentarily, is smart enough to figure out the Trojan Horse. And it's the Trojan Horse that goes inside the city of Troy, also called Ilium, and that's how it ends. That's the beginning and the end of the story. But Homer doesn't do that. He starts out right in the middle of things. He doesn't start at the beginning. He doesn't end at the end. He drops us right in the middle, in media res. It's a wonderful technique for an author because it's not where you expect, so it captures your attention. But I'm wondering, as I go through this story, what can I learn as a physician? And I'm wondering, are doctors faced with that situation all the time? When their patients come into their offices, do the patients start with the beginning of their illness? No, they start in the middle. And how good are we at understanding, being dropped in media res, what really is going on in that story that we're asked to confront? Homer doesn't start at the beginning or the end. He starts with something very clever. He starts with the rage of Achilles. Achilles is the greatest warrior, and he's very angry. And he's angry because his concubine has been stolen from him by his commander, and he refuses, therefore, to fight. And the Greeks can't win unless Achilles fights, and he's sitting on the sideline doing nothing. Well, it's not until Achilles' rage shifts from his commander Agamemnon to his opponent Hector, who is the prince of Troy and the brother of Paris, when that rage changes from Agamemnon to Hector, that Achilles now gets back into the fight, and we know that the war will end at that time. This story is utterly brutal. It's linear. It starts and goes to the end, and it's all about war. If there is one Greek word that you could apply to the Iliad, it's kleos, the pursuit of fame. That was the goal of all the warriors as they participated in this story. And Homer's depiction of the battles are almost unbelievable. I'll give you two examples. In one particular situation, a Trojan has a spear enter the back of his head, and it exits through his mouth, separating his hard palate. And the blood wells up behind his eyes and comes out his nose in such a way that it is completely graphic and totally accurate. In another particular setting, Homer says of Agamemnon, who's about to kill a man who's begging for his life, Homer says, "He took his sharp sword and cleaved his head and limbs and kicked him through the ranks like a rolling stone." This kind of graphic description of the brutality of the war is characteristic of the Iliad. But Homer's good enough to give us a break in a couple of situations, and I'd like to point them out. For example, Achilles has lost his armor, and he has to have a new shield made for him. Homer knows we need a break. This has been very, very brutal. So he takes some time and describes all the beautiful scenes that have been inscribed on Achilles' new shield. It's a rest for us from the war. And it's an extraordinary depiction of human life in many, many different situations. On the farm, in the city, at home, and a welcome relief from the brutality of the war otherwise. But perhaps the most remarkable change from linearity, masculine, pursuit of fame, comes at the very end. Achilles has finally killed Hector, who was the son of the king of Troy. And his body is lying on the field. And Achilles will not allow that body to be buried. Now, according to the traditions of the time, you had to bury the body. It just had to be done. It was necessary for religious purposes. And Achilles was determined not to let that happen. Priam, who happens to be the father of Hector, has watched all of this from the walls of Troy. He's seen his son killed in battle with Achilles, and he's seen his son's corpse dragged around on the field in front of Troy, and he can do nothing about it. Well, at night, here comes Hermes, our god of transition. He takes Priam, the old man, and leads him out of Troy, through no man's land into the Greek camp. It's night. Achilles is in his tent, and Hermes leads Priam into Achilles' tent. Achilles cannot believe it. Before anything can happen or he can say something, Priam drops to his knees, and he grasps Achilles' knees, and then he takes his hand, and Priam kisses Achilles' hand. And he says, "I kiss the hand of the man that killed my son." Achilles is spellbound. He can't say anything. And before he can, Priam then says, "And just think, how will your father cry when you die? How will he feel when you're gone?" Now, Achilles knows, it's been foretold that once Hector dies, and Hector's out there, that Achilles will die very soon. So he knows it's coming, and his father Peleus will weep for him. At that point, Achilles raises Priam, this old man, this intergenerational encounter, and they embrace, and they cry together. It's the first time in the poem where Achilles has shown any empathy for anyone. And it's a profound change from the linearity and the masculine pursuit of fame that we've seen throughout the poem, and a very important clue to where we might head in the next story, the Odyssey. We've said that this story is masculine and linear, but Homer has two depictions of femininity that I wanted to share with you from this. It said, "Ruin is woman, strong and swift." And Agamemnon says, "Ruin is Zeus's daughter, entangling men one by one." There's nothing sympathetic about the feminine in this story. This story was believed to be true, factual. The Trojan War was what the Greeks thought was their history. And in fact, Herodotus and Thucydides, the great historians of the ancient Greek world, believed that and wrote that in their stories. 100 and some years later, Alexander the Great said, "I want to go to Troy." And he stopped in Troy on his way around the Mediterranean, and a wonderful story there if we have time. But soon, Troy was no longer inhabited, and the country where it was located, the Hittite Empire, had changed, and it was soon forgotten. And in the modern world, there was great doubt as to whether or not Troy had even existed or the war had even occurred. And here it wasn't until 1870 that Heinrich Schliemann, who was an amateur archaeologist, decided that he would look for Troy and in fact found it. He is a very colorful person. He was dishonest, a rogue, absolutely a bloviating narcissist. But he was also passionate about finding Troy, and he did. So in the way that Milman Parry has shown us in the modern times that these poems could be done in this way, Schliemann has shown us that in fact the Trojan War actually occurred because he excavated Troy. Well, this is leading up to our discussion of the Odyssey, which we'll enter now. By the way, if there are any questions or interruptions that you would like, raise your hand. Be glad to take those, but we'll take them at the end too, if you like. Please.
You had said, you're making me want to read Homer.
Good.
You had said that the Iliad was the great epic poem of the Greeks. A way I understand that is that the Hebrew Testament of the Bible, the Old Testament, is, and I believe it is more than this, but it is the epic of the great epic of the people called Jews. Is there some similarity there?
Yes. Thanks for saying so. I would agree with you. In fact, those are the two pillars of Western civilization and culture. Those two. And it's interesting that there probably was some relationship between that part of the world, the Levant, and Greece, and we'll find that out in the names. For example, the name Achilles really comes from Achilleus, which may have been Minoan. And another name, for example, the island where Kirke lives, we'll come to this in a minute, is probably a Semitic word, meaning land of the hawk. So there was an awful lot of travel and communication that existed before these stories were ultimately written down. And the influences are replete in these stories from all around the Mediterranean, as you've suggested. Well, whereas we talked about the nature of the Iliad, the Odyssey is circuitous, it's feminine. The Odyssey is all about the women and their influence on Odysseus. And I think that if there's a word that identifies this story, the Greek word would be nostos, which means homecoming. We said that kleos, the pursuit of fame, was appropriate and best applied to the Iliad, but nostos, and trying to get home, is the word that we would use for the Odyssey. And we'll see at the end how these two stories come together remarkably. As we go through this, there are three themes that I will try to lay out for you and we can talk about. The one is the feminine and how the feminine influences our story. And then Homer has so many clever ways of doing things, but he will use an olive tree in some very clever ways as we go through the story, and I'll try to point those out. And then, of course, we've mentioned weaving in cloth and how important that is as a metaphor as well as a part of our story. Well, just like the Iliad, Homer does not start at the beginning. He doesn't start with Odysseus on the beach of Troy waiting for a ride home. He starts in the middle of the story. And he doesn't even start with Odysseus. He starts with Odysseus' son, Telemachus. This is circuitous, and I'd like to take you through it in the way that Homer tells it, because it makes the point of what a clever storyteller he is and how he emphasizes certain things. The first four books of the Odyssey are called the Telemachy, or all about Telemachus the son. And Telemachus is back home in Ithaca, and he's got a problem. He's 20 years old now. His father's been gone for 20 years. And there are 108 men that want to marry his mother. That's a big problem. And they're all in his house, and they all don't appreciate him. So he's got a problem. But along comes Athena, a goddess of war who loves Odysseus and his family. And she takes the person of mentor. Now, mentor comes from the word of this individual from the poem who was given the responsibility of raising Telemachus when Odysseus had to leave and go fight the Trojan War. And so mentor comes to Telemachus and says, you got to get out of town. Go look for your father. In the same way that your father went looking for his glory in Troy, you've got to go look for your own father. It's your own way of looking for your kleos. But you got to find him. But this is an important concept. We use the word mentor every day. We have mentors all over the place in our lives, especially in medical school. And I'm thinking about the importance of mentor as it would be for a physician. We can learn an awful lot of molecular biology, but we don't learn how to be a doctor until someone shows us. Those people that show us exactly how to do things are our mentors. And medicine is an apprenticeship. And the people that teach us, our mentors, are the people that show us how really to be a doctor. And that whole concept of mentoring comes, and that word comes from Homer's Odyssey. Well, Telemachus takes off looking for his father, and he has 2 stops to see 2 different men that served with his father in Trojan War, and he finds out that, in fact, his father still is probably alive, although it's been 20 years. He's been heard of, but nobody knows exactly where he is. And that's where he's left, out looking for his father. In the meantime, we find out that Odysseus is stuck on an island. We'll find out later how he got there, but he's on the island of Ogygia with an absolutely beautiful goddess whose name is Calypso. And she is the most beautiful woman he could have. He's lived there for 7 years, and she's offered him immortality, and all he has to do is have sex with her every night. Now, a younger man might say, well, what's the problem? But Odysseus is not a younger man, and he's not happy. He sits on a rocky promontory crying every day, wants to go home. Nostos, I want to go home. And he's not able to. Not able to until Hermes is sent by Zeus and Athena down to the island to tell Calypso, you've got to let him go. Well, she's not happy, but she knows it's coming, and so she helps him. And the first thing she does is help him build a raft. When you read this, you'll realize how much Homer appreciates craftsmanship. The wood that's selected, the tools that are used, the steps that are taken, how Odysseus builds his raft is absolutely beautiful and reminds me of the meticulous technical competence required by somebody who might be a surgeon, for example. You have to be that good, especially if you're going to sail us across the sea. You better have it right. And he does. He builds this beautiful raft, and then off he goes. And Homer gives us another description of competence. Odysseus is sailing, but he has no compass, but he has the stars. And Homer knew that. And the description of Odysseus sailing across the sea, or as Homer would say, the sea's broad back, his epithet. We see Odysseus sitting in the back of his raft with his arms wrapped around the tiller, but his head looking skyward to keep Orion off to his left. That's what he's been told, and that's how he'll get home. Well, he's on his way, but Poseidon is very unhappy. He wasn't on Olympus when the okay was given to send Odysseus home, and when he comes and sees Odysseus at sea, he throws up a storm. He throws up a huge storm, so great that the raft starts to break up. As he is watching his raft break up, he's thinking to himself, what should I do now? Should I abandon the raft? Should I stay with it? Should I swim for shore? And at that moment, a goddess in the person of a bird appears. Her name is Ino, or Leucothea, 2 different names. And if you've ever been at sea and seen the large waves and watched how the seabirds dip down in between the mounds of water on either side and then come up again, Homer had a beautiful description of this goddess, and she has wrapped around her a sash, a piece of cloth, and she says to Odysseus, wrap this around you and swim to shore. Odysseus says, thank you. But he stays with the raft, and he says to himself, I still got a raft. It's not much. I'm still actually straddling the keel. That's all that's left of my raft. But as long as I'm floating, I don't think I'll do that. He thinks back and forth. He's been told what to do. He says, no, it doesn't make sense to me. Now, any of you who might have been sailors know that there is a rule. You only climb up into your life raft. You never climb down into a life raft. If If you still have a boat, you still have something to hang on, you don't deploy your life raft. Well, he's right. And he waits till the final wave destroys the remnant of his raft. He wraps the sash around him that Ino has given him, and he swims for shore. Well, happily he makes it. He's exhausted, and he pulls himself underneath an olive tree, half domestic, half wild, and he falls asleep. And it's not until the next morning that he's wakened by a group of girls that have come down to do their laundry. And he hears them singing and playing. Now he's got a problem. He's naked. He's been at sea for 18 days. He looks awful. How is he going to get them to help him? You hear Odysseus think back and forth. Well, he said, the first thing I'm going to do is cover myself. So he breaks off a branch and covers himself. And then he approaches the girl who seems to be the leader, and her name is Nausicaa. She's a teenager, but he is so good with his words. Dear girl, I must look awful, but I do need your help. I've been at sea, and he is so perfect in the circumstance that she doesn't run away, and she says, okay, I will help you. And after they get to know one another, she says, why don't you come back to the palace? Because I happen to be the princess, and mom and dad are the king and the queen. And so she says, I'll even give you my clothes. You can wear my clothes. Well, Odysseus is thinking, this young girl is going to go back to the palace with a man who's 2.5 times her age, dressed in her clothes. How is that going to work? That is every father's nightmare. And he's very wise. He says, thank you. I will wear your clothes, but I'll follow the cart that takes you back to the palace. And so he is able to negotiate this. And Nausicaa says, and oh, by the way, when you get to the palace, mom and dad are the king and the queen, talk to mom. She's the one. He gets it. And so, when he gets to the palace, he importunes the queen. Her name is Arete. And his language is impeccable. Because you can imagine the circumstances. How is he going to explain himself? But it is wonderful. She doesn't say very much. But the king is so impressed, he says, that's great. How would you like to marry my daughter? Well, Odysseus has been so good with his words that he's talked himself out of one problem and right into another. But he's good there too. And he says to the king, Alcinous, your daughter is far too beautiful and she's too young and I'm already married and I want to go home. And he makes the point that he should go home, and they agree to that. Mind you, he's not said yet who he is. The standard of behavior in the classical world was to accept a stranger without any questions, be nice to the stranger, and then help that person go on the way. In fact, Homer has it put beautifully. Welcome the stranger, speed the parting guest. That's how you relate to someone who comes into your house. Well, after being there for a couple of days, it's pretty clear that it's going to be okay. Odysseus has talked him out of a couple of problems, and he's been well received. And at a party at the palace one night, the bard who was singing happens to be blind. His name is Demodocus. He starts to sing of the Trojan War. Of course, Odysseus had come from there. He knows the story. He starts to weep. And the king says, wow, maybe a different story. So he has him change the story, and a funny story is told. But the next night, back to the war and the story of the Trojan Horse. This is the only time we hear about the Trojan Horse in all of Homer, in a story, in retrospect. But Odysseus starts to cry again. And this time the king says, okay, 2 nights in a row, who are you really? And it's at that point that Odysseus can tell him who he is. I think there's an interesting lesson here. Many times later we'll realize that Odysseus doesn't say who he is or even tell the truth. In fact, he lies many times. But We don't hear the truth, or we don't tell the truth, unless we're in a safe place. And I thought about how important that is for a physician in a relationship in media res with a new patient who has a new problem. How can we create places that are so safe that the person entrusted to our care will tell us the truth? Without that, we have no chance of being helpful. And different people need different environments. That's the art in medicine. How do we create a safe environment for anyone, everyone, so that we can hear the truth? But at this point, Odysseus tells the truth. It's an amazing story, and he says, okay, I'll tell you what happened to me. And it's not until this point that we find out that he actually left the battlefield of Troy, and we find out what actually happened to him. Well, he left Troy, and very quickly, his world became surreal, became absolutely strange. One stop for provisions and a fight, and then onto an island where he encountered the Cyclops. He was in a cave. Cyclops wasn't there. Odysseus and his men went into the cave. They assumed that they would be welcomed and that they would be given gifts, as we all would always do for our strange friends. And so they ate the cheese and drank the milk and had a nice time until a Cyclops came back and ate some of his men. And it was clear that wasn't going to go well. Odysseus had done a very important thing, however. When asked what his name was, he said nobody. He'd already gone to Troy. He already had all the chaos you could want. He was a famous man. They were singing about him. But now he's nobody. He's relinquishing that identity. He said, my name is nobody. Well, that integrity was also important, but it also saved his life in a minute. By the time he figures out how to get away from the Cyclops, and it's clever, the Cyclops is drunk and in the cave, and Odysseus and his men take a long pole made out of olive wood. They sharpen it, they put it in the fire, and while he's asleep, they extinguish Polyphemus's eye. The description is brutal. Homer says that they forced this red-hot spike into his eye. The eye bubbled and then burst. The description is graphic. But blind, Polyphemus could no longer see them, and that blindness allowed them to escape. And so when Polyphemus is screaming, and all of his friends say, what hurt you? He said, nobody. That was the name he'd been given. And so they did not come to his aid, and that allowed Odysseus and his men to escape. But he made a mistake, Odysseus. He was so proud of himself on the way out that once in the ship he said, no, it wasn't nobody that blinded you, it was me, Odysseus. I blinded you. Well, that was the wrong thing to say, because Polyphemus tore off the top of a mountain, threw it at the ship, almost sank the ship. But the bigger problem is that Polyphemus' father was Poseidon, and he was the god of the sea. And it's over the sea's broad back that Odysseus is trying to get home. So he's going to have a problem by bragging who he was. Is there a problem when we brag of our fame? Rhetorical question. Doctors? Anyway. I'll take this quickly, but there are several other episodes that we go through. Once he leaves Polyphemus, he winds up in an island where the king is Aeolus and gives him a bag of winds that will help him get home. They're almost home. But his colleagues and compatriots don't trust Odysseus. They should. They think that something else is in the bag and it might be worth something and it should be for them. And they open the bag because they're greedy, and all the winds escape, and they're blown off course and no longer headed for Ithaca. In fact, their next stop is at the land of the Lastrygonians, and the bad news there is that both the king and the queen eat people. So this is a very scary place. Finally, they get away from the Lastrygonians, and they wind up on this island of Aea. It means the land of the hawk. It's a Semitic word. And Odysseus is smart enough to send half his men in to see what's going on the land of Aea. This is as far away as you can get from normality. It's also the oldest story probably in the Odyssey. If the Odyssey is a composite of these wonderful tales, this may be the oldest. And half his men go inland and, of course, are greeted by Circe, Circe, the Greek word encircle. And they are turned into pigs with her wand. Fortunately, one of the soldiers comes back and tells Odysseus this. And what's Odysseus to do? He has no way of managing this. Well, fortunately, Hermes comes on and says, I can help you in this transition. There is an antidote for her magic that she will give you to drink, and it's called moly. It's a white flower with a black root. And if you take that before you eat what she gives you, her magic won't work. Draw your sword and force her to do what we want, what you want. So armed with that information, that's exactly what Odysseus does, and it works. By the time he confronts Circe, and her magic no longer works, she's now immediately on his side. Turns his men back from pigs into men. And Odysseus and his men stay there for a period of time, but then realize that they have to continue their journey and are told by Circe that they must go into the underworld to find out how really to get home. There was a wonderful lecture at the Schemel Forum last year about the trip into the underworld. This is such a common story. Dante has it, the Christian myth has this. I think, but Homer starts this. There are so many ways in which this has been articulated, but the trip into the underworld and coming out the other side with new knowledge, some kind of wonderful insight, is important. And the underworld can be a metaphor for the unconscious, as we'll explore in a bit. Well, he knows he's got to go there. Here's another thought about Odysseus. He doesn't complain. He doesn't claim victimhood. Every time he's got to do something, it's tough. It's hard. And sometimes he said, it would have been easier if I had died in the battlefields of Troy. But he accepts the hardships as part of life, and he carries on. Interesting lesson, I think. Anyway, he's off to Hades, and he goes with his men. He does exactly what he's supposed to do. He digs a trench, he pours the blood in, and he evokes the spirits of the underworld. He encounters some amazing people, but a couple are really important. One is his mother. She died. He didn't know that. Her name is Anticleia. Remember we said that names mean something? Anti against, Cleia from the root kleos, fame. She didn't want him to go to fight in the Battle of Troy. She wanted him to stay home. You don't need any kleos. You don't need to do that. You're Anticleia. He encounters his mother, Anticleia. He didn't know she had died. He asked her what had happened, and she said, well, I died because I was missing you. And Odysseus says 3 times he reaches out to embrace this waif, and 3 times she drifts like a mist through his arms. It's an extraordinary description of that event, and Odysseus cannot embrace his mother. The next person, or one of the next people he encounters, is Achilles. Well, we know Achilles had died at Troy, but he says, Achilles, how wonderful to see you. You are the most famous warrior we've had. What a great honor it must be. And Achilles says, no. It's not that. It's not what you think. He said, better to be alive as a slave one day on earth than to rule over all the dead. This encounter and this comment is just as unexpected in this story as Priam's encounter with Achilles was in the Iliad. You didn't expect it, but what a remarkable change. And in this setting, is Homer telling us something about the pursuit of fame? Is that the important thing? Achilles says, no. I died an incomplete person. He didn't say that, but that's what happened. And then we see Tiresias. And Tiresias, the blind seer of Thebes, who spent 7 years as a woman, is the person who's really going to tell Odysseus how to get home. And he's a major figure in my story that I wanted to present for you today. He tells Odysseus, here's how you got to do it. You're going to have to go through, you're going to have to suffer, you're going to have all kinds of things, but you will get home. You will suffer, but you will get home. And then he says the unexpected. What you will do is take your oar, which is perceived as a weapon of war, and you will walk inland until it's no longer seen as a weapon of war, but a winnowing fork. Swords and plowshares. And when you get that far, plant your oar. Make your supplications to Poseidon, whom you've offended, and there you will die, an old man, surrounded by your family. This has nothing to do with the pursuit of Kleos. This is an entirely different outcome. And yet, it's the only time that we find out what's going to happen to Odysseus and what Homer might think about all of this. I think that what I'd like to do is accelerate through the end of the Odyssey if I can, because I've told you the most important parts of this. The good news is that at this point, Odysseus knows how to get home, and he does. And Telemachus, who's been in search of Odysseus, has been told to come home, and he does. And so the two of them meet. And there are some beautiful scenes of recognition for Odysseus. My favorite. When Odysseus left to go fight in Troy, he had a hound. The dog was named Argos, and he loved him. Well, Argos had not been well cared for the last 20 years. Somehow he made that long. And when Odysseus comes back, there's Argos, flea and tick infested, sitting on a dunghill. Odysseus can't tell who he is because he doesn't know who he can trust because he's not in a safe place. So he walks up the hill, and there's Argos. And Homer says, Argos spotted him. He dropped his ears, and he wagged his tail, and then he died. Odysseus' first recognition when he gets back home. There are other recognitions which are equally fascinating. His nurse sees a scar that she knew existed on his leg, and she spots him. He puts his hand over her mouth, don't say anything. And it's not until he and his son Telemachus can get the two remaining faithful people together and encounter the 108 suitors who are trying to take over his home and his wife that he can prevail. He ultimately does, and that's a very quick summary of the last part of the Odyssey. There are many wonderful stories in here which we'll forego because of time. But Odysseus and Telemachus then take this back. The only person that has not accepted him, Odysseus, at this point is Penelope, his wife. And she's testing him. She's looking for a safe place too. Is this guy really who he says he is? And despite the fact that her son, Telemachus, says, yeah, this is him, and the servants say, oh yeah, that really is him, Penelope is going to test him one final time. And she says, well, let's just move our bed over there. Odysseus is outraged. He said, you can't, because the bed was made by me, and I made it out of an olive tree. An olive tree. It can't be moved. I crafted it myself. And the only people that know this bed can't be moved is you, Penelope, and me, Odysseus, and our maid. And that was the information offered that allowed Penelope to finally say, okay, you are my husband, you are my Odysseus. And the lovely moment then comes when they go to bed, and Athena stretches out the night to make it just a little bit extra long for them on their reconciliation. So there's a little bit more to the Odyssey, but this is where I would like to leave it, and leave you with a couple more thoughts. These two stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the pursuit of Kleos and coming home, the premature death of the fully integrated human mind, personality, these two stories really do fit together. And it wasn't until maybe 120 or 30 years ago that modern psychology started to apply terminology for this. Freud and then Jung. And the great thing about Jung, in my opinion, was his examination of what was normal, not what was pathologic. And Jung said, there is an important time that comes in life, which is midlife. And we have to make a remarkable accommodation to what happens to us in midlife. This is both men and women, but if we're talking about Odysseus, he will make it a man. If we're talking about men. In the first half of life, we're pursuing kleos, the fame, the career, the identity. Who are we going to be? If I'm a man, well, I'm going to be a man. If I'm going to be a this or that, I'm going to be this. And we have to pursue that. But in order to do that, we've had to subordinate other interests, which Jung calls the shadow. There are certain things we cannot do that we've had to subordinate. And one of those things that we cannot do is be the opposite, the feminine. And Jung says that there is a feminine side to the masculine psyche, that unless he integrates that properly in midlife, that person can never become a whole person or individuated or a complete individual. That was Jung's interpretation of the transformation in midlife. Is there a better depiction of this in story than what we've just heard? Odysseus going to Troy, winning all the fame and identity that a young man could stand or could have. But then, wise enough on the way home to have all the feminine influences on him, on his psyche, beginning with Kirke, encircler, Calypso, coverer. We haven't even talked about Scylla, Charybdis, and the Sirens, because I had to abbreviate the story, but they're all three big threats, and they're all feminine. He had to encounter every one of those in order to get home. But in so doing, coming back with his wife and integrating with her as a couple, he has become a complete person. And Carl Jung would say that that is the goal of life, and that Homer has many fascinating things to say about mortality, immortality, but if this gift of life is to be completed, that is how it's done. Life is painful, it's dangerous, it's scary, but it involves growth. And so, in able to do that and to reach that, we have to be able to accept the painful and the scary and the dangerous. In closing, I'd like to just mention a couple of observations that may have already been obvious to you about how some of these ideas apply to medicine. The journey is long and very hard. To become a technical expert is absolutely necessary. But once there, you got to improvise. We all need mentors continually through our lives. And how are we going to manage chaos? We need a mission. We need a nostos. We've got to know where we're going. And we need a compass. And we need mentors. And we have to be aware that our patients will drop us in media res every time the story starts. Truth requires a safe place. Suffering is inevitable. What's our stance to it? Do we take a victim stance? How do we help our patients in that regard? I have one quote that I would like to leave you with before we close. This comes from George Steiner, which I think is a perfect place for us right now. We've come to realize that myths are among the subtlest and most direct languages of experience. They reenact moments of signal truth or crisis in the human condition. But mythology is more than history made memorable. The mythographer, the poet, is the historian of the unconscious. This gives to the great myths their haunting universality. Homer does speak to our time too. Thank you. You've been wonderful to sit through all of this, and I have absolutely loved getting ready for this. And if you would like to continue the conversation, if there are any questions, I'm happy to deal with those. Couple questions, sure.
Time for a few
Harmar, just following up on your last statement,
Yes.
There's a well-known classics professor at Harvard. He teaches a course entitled Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan.
And he relates Dylan classics.
Okay.
Dylan, both in his ballads and in his thinking, talks about Homer, Virgil, and the Odyssey.
Right.
What do you correlate the currency with that?
I have two answers. Number one, Dylan's poems were short, so they'd be lyric poetry, not epic poetry. And secondly, I would have gone, and Homer would have gone to get the Nobel Prize. Homer knew he was good, but he loved the respect that he had, that his craft had. So he would have been in Stockholm in a minute with his own poem and his lyre underneath his left arm. John.
In the Odyssey, is Homer advantage of these things in terms of stories?
The hyperbole?
Yeah.
It's either hyperbole or it's so strange. It's completely out of the realm of our experience. But that's what he's doing when he takes Odysseus through all of these remarkable experiences, which really is, from a psychological standpoint, Odysseus integrating the feminine into his personality. He has no experience with this. A man in midlife feels adrift. Things aren't going so well. It's universal. By the way, this is important for doctors to know. You're going to feel like that, and so are your patients. And if we don't deal with it properly, we make the mistake of continuing to go back. And we know the story of the older doctor who marries the younger nurse 3 times. Doesn't work. You can't get it right. You got to deal with the problem, and it's you, not them. And we laugh, but it's so pervasive. And I think that these are the kinds of things that we should be warning our physicians about, and they ought to be aware of. This is going to happen to you, by the way. Think of all the things you've had to subordinate while you pursued being a doctor. You've had to put all of that aside. Delayed gratification is probably the best definition of a medical student that I know. And Homer talks about it. I didn't get a chance to tell you the story about delayed gratification, but it's in there. And unless we do that, we can't get to where we want to go. But in getting to where we want to go, we now got to go back and deal with what we have subordinated or set aside. And that can be very difficult. It can be off-putting, and it can throw us right off our game. Our job isn't by the time we're in our mid-40s, our job isn't as good as we thought it was. Our wife isn't as pretty as she should be. The kids are crazy. And I don't like this town anyway. So those are the kinds of distress that if I were that man's doctor, I'd say, absolutely, you're right. That's exactly the way you ought to feel. And by the way, you're going to get through it. And here are the steps that you can take. And don't make these mistakes. Odysseus doesn't make the mistakes. He thinks both sides of it very carefully. And he makes a couple of mistakes, but he's able to survive them. But I think this is a really important lesson, not only for how we take care of patients and what happens to people psychologically in their growth, but how we, as physicians, go through that same process. Yes?
So you said the 2 themes of the Iliad and the Odyssey were Kleos and Nostos, the theme of the homecoming. Many would argue that the theme of the Iliad could be also Manus, the wrath, the godly unchecked wrath of Achilles. And the theme of the Odyssey could be Manus, the turning over, the thinking, the insinuosity of Odysseus.
Yes.
Do you think there's any roles to that in that burgeoning position?
Yeah, I think I would completely agree with you. In fact, when you think about it, Homer begins the Iliad by the wrath of Achilles. That's how he starts it. He doesn't start with Paris running away with Helen. It begins with the wrath of Achilles, and it ends when that wrath is over. Now, my interpretation, I think it's a fascinating story about what Jung would say was a constellated complex. Achilles is really angry that his concubine was stolen from him. And his behavior then deteriorated. He was taken over by that complex until he killed Hector and until Priam came and importuned him in his tent, and then it ended. Now, we all encounter these complexes. You ever seen road rage? That's a little complex. Comes and it goes. This was a longer complex. Complexes can last a long time. But I think that the story of the Iliad is really about Achilles' complex. Please.
I was thinking in terms of the medical school, the Iliad is the story of our young doctors, bright, powerful, well-equipped, and the strength of their conviction. And the Odyssey is the story of the doctor who is cunning and achieves a success because he's so knowledgeable about the patient. And together, the mentoring that you do for these students equips them when they get to that stage of their life as you have.
I would completely agree with you, Peter, and I think the word is mentoring. All of us need a mentor all the time. We're never too old, and all of us can mentor somebody. We're never too young. So that relationship of helping the other is so important, both in this story but also in medicine. I remember who taught me something rather than the textbook I finished. I know who the doctor was when I made my first diagnosis. I even remember her name. Her name was Eileen Cabbage Stalk. She was an American Indian. I've never forgotten her. I remember the moment of that diagnosis, but I couldn't tell you how I learned about the disease that she had. I'm sorry, Sandra. Sorry, Sandra. Yeah.
Is it true that both the Iliad and the Odyssey are constructed in 24
Yes,
chapters?
and it is. And one of the
The second question then would be, why is the number 24?
It's a great question. First of all, it wasn't written that way. And the reason it was put into 24 books was that's about as much as you could write on a papyrus. And we didn't get a chance to tell the story, but Alexander the Great, can I tell one quick story before we go? This is so cool. Alexander the Great revered Homer. He slept with a copy of the Iliad. He did. And when he became king, by the way, he probably killed his father, and he was 20 years old, and he was leaving Macedonia, he was going to chase Darius III right back to Persia. On the way back to Persia, Darius leaves his wife and kids behind and makes his getaway. So Homer captures his tent. Alexander, thank you. Alexander captures Darius's tent and all the things that are in it. Inside is a gold box. The gold box is just the right size for him to put his copy of the Iliad. And so Alexander carries Homer's Iliad in a gold box he stole from Darius III, and he let Darius go as he went down to Egypt. And when he was at Egypt, he had a dream. Alexander had a dream. And he dreamt about the island off the coast of Egypt. Well, that's in the Odyssey. That's how Menelaus gets home. Alexander believed that was a divine implant in his mind, and that he would then build a city in Egypt at that place. And he did. And not only did he build Alexandria, he built the greatest library of the ancient world. And it was in that library that all the scholars from around the ancient world would come to study, and Homer's work was recorded on papyruses, and you could only put this much on one papyrus, and it took 24 papyruses to get all of his work into writing, and that's why it's been divided into 24 books.
There's one right here. You've been asked.
Yes. Please.
Talked about Athena being
Yeah.
she's got wisdom and
Thank you.
and then talking about how she fends it off.
I would love to, except that but I realize you're absolutely right. I had to short-circuit some of this. But as you point out, and you've said it so well, that Athena is not just the goddess of war, but of weaving and wisdom necessary, and that Penelope, in doing her weaving, has told all the suitors, as soon as I finish this weaving, which will be a burial shroud for my father-in-law, I'll marry one of you. Well, every night she goes and undoes all the things she's done during the day. She's a very clever woman, very smart lady. She's as smart in her world as Odysseus is in his, which is why they're coming together at the end. She wins Kleos in an entirely new way, not on the battlefield. And he achieves Kleos by coming together with his wife, integrating the feminine, growing to be a grateful old man surrounded by his family. That's a wonderful story, but you've helped me to fill in some of the gaps that I left. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
dear.
Thank you. We wonder
Is that okay?
How could we even live without myth and metaphor? I think both of them have played a big part in today's conversation. Remember, we have 2 more Schemel forums this semester. We're going to learn about Putin's poker game, what he has in store for us on April 28th by well-known to you, Jill Doherty, a distinguished Scrantonian and a distinguished scholar of Russia. And then finally, and we hope this is neither myth or metaphor, we're going to be talking about the rule of law at a roundtable discussion on May 8th. So thank you all for coming, and see you later.
Oh, good. I would love that.